In the beginning, essentially, the protest, if you were to say, describe the protesters, they were Bucks Countyans, basically who lived along the river, who feared a 92 million gallon a day pump sucking water out of the river.
I think I'd call it an uprising. It was a vibrant expression of the people will not be stopped.
It became this act of civil disobedience where, good people wound up in jail. One of the things that happened in Lumberville was that you couldn't hold your head up in the village unless you'd been arrested.
No violence! No violence! Back it up! No violence! Dump the pump! Save the river! Dump the pump! Save the river! Dump the pump! Save the river!
This is one of the most amazing things I've ever seen in Bucks County. There must be 600 people out here, all of them very determined to stop the pumping station.
But I'm here to stop something that's really bad. Hey, watch out.
Shame on you! 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 Shame on you!
I worked in journalism for 30 years, and I never saw this type of reaction to a government project.
People did not want their land and their community overrun by profiteering interests.
I don't think anyone in or out of government could have foreseen it. I have characterized the pump project and the upheaval, the disruption, the debates that it generated as the most historic, volatile issue to face Bucks County since the Civil War.
Well, Point Pleasant was a kind of scruffy little village that had a lot of old-timers who had been there for many, many years. There wasn't much there. There was a post office. There was a bar, which was the center of social life, Applejack's. And I believe there was a plant store, and that was about it. There were a couple roads that went up the hill on one side, and the Point Pleasant ran alongside the river. There actually also was a general store in Point Pleasant that served food, but it was a tiny little village of maybe, I'm guessing, maybe 150 people, 125 people.
In the 1950s, Bucks County was devastated by hurricanes, and in the Chamonix Creek, overflowed and farmers were wiped out. A few years later, a great drought came, and farmers again, people's wells went dried up. So the theory was, if we can build some controlled flood protection in times of drought, and in times of flood, and if we can ensure some water supply in times of drought, then that's a project worth doing.
Well, the pump was kind of what I would refer to as a kind of a Rube Goldberg contraption for supplying public water. The water was taken from the Delaware River at a little town called Point Pleasant along the Delaware. It was pumped uphill to a reservoir that was to be constructed in Plumstead Township on Bradshaw Road. They were going to call that the Bradshaw Reservoir. From there, the water would have gone in two directions. The first direction was northward towards a water treatment plant in Bedminster Township that was built because they were required to treat the water from the Delaware before they discharged it into the east branch of the Perkiomen Creek, where it was to flow down to the creek to approximately Royersford, I believe, if I remember correctly, and then was to be pumped out of the creek there and over to the Limerick power plant in Pottstown. The other aspect of the project was they were going to release water from the Bradshaw Reservoir into the north branch of the Neshaminy Creek, and it would flow ultimately into Lake Galena. From there, it was to be released down into the east branch of the Neshaminy Creek, and to be treated in a treatment plant that was to be constructed in Chalfont to supply public water to Montgomery County and portions of Bucks County.
So let's use the Delaware River as the source for the water supply, build some dams along Bucks County for the flood control.
I had a visceral reaction to the fact that this project was going on at all. And I was afraid of, again, what it would do to our immediate area, but also to Bucks County.
So Delaware Unlimited formed really because of an application put forward by corporations and agencies that were basically their shills to remove water from the Delaware River in order to provide cooling water to be evaporated at a nuclear power plant 40 miles away on the Schuylkill River, and also to develop Bucks and Montgomery counties.
Well, the way I looked at it was that the Point Pleasant pumping station was something that was being promoted as a means to construct infrastructure to support the development of Bucks County, which I was really adamantly opposed to at the time.
My biggest fear was that it would damage the ecology of the Delaware River. That was my biggest fear. My second biggest fear was that I didn't agree with where the water was going at the time. I felt that to pump water to a nuclear power plant was just foolish, especially when that nuclear power plant had water not more than a couple of miles from it.
Limerick was poorly sited. It was put on a river that didn't have enough water to cool it. So it was way too large, and it was also poorly located. So it should never have been built there. For them to build a project like that, a huge nuclear power plant, and not have the water readily available, and then have to use a Rube Goldberg system that would have devastating environmental impacts all along its way, was totally irresponsible and should have been rejected by the government agencies from the get-go.
It was, I think, a lot later into the process when I saw the absolute public disapproval of it. I couldn't imagine political leaders going against the will of their constituents, and it was clear to me that the electorate, their constituents, didn't want it.
The Republican candidates supported the building of the pump. The Democrat candidates opposed the building of the pump, and thus the clash of the election was on.
The protesters were from all walks of life. I myself, I'm an accountant. I had my own accounting practice. There were teachers. I can remember teachers taking off from work. I took off from work. There were young people. There were old people.
It was essentially everybody. You saw people in their 60s and their 70s out there. You saw young college students, teenagers. I knew you saw people from both political parties, leaders from both political parties. It was just an issue that cut across lines.
There were wealthy people, there were poor people, there were people who had education and people who didn't. Republicans, Democrats, independents, a real cross-section of the county, old and young. It was truly a diverse and very active group of people.
We really had thousands of members because of the way we organized in chapters. Also, there were organizations that already existed that joined, and so they brought members as well. So it was largely a grassroots movement that pulled in a lot of people.
It was interesting. My dad was a Second World War veteran. He came out to the protests. One of our board members was a school teacher in Council Rock. Her husband was a former Marine.
It was all very personal. This wasn't about a problem that was happening, miles and miles away or in another country or another land. This was something that was happening in our own backyards because we all lived along the Delaware River and really had very strong feelings about the river.
But this struggle will continue to be fought in Bucks County. My name is Chuck Yarmark. I am a businessman in this county. I am not a radical. I am not motivated by anything un-American. I am concerned. I want this country to go on being free the way my parents raised me.
The first thing that I guess really impressed me was the amount of public interest in it. And the thing that really opened my eyes was basically we held rallies initially when they announced they were going to begin construction of the pumping station. And then we decided that we were going to have an active demonstration at the site on the day that they were to begin construction. And what really amazed me was when I arrived in Point Pleasant 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, suddenly there were probably thousands of people there. And I really didn't expect that. I never would have expected that.
We did a lot of stuff that kept the Point Pleasant pump fight in the news. It was front page for many months. It became an international story in some circles. But I remember, I think it was January 6th in 1983 when the construction company was coming. This little town, which has got, we got 700 people maybe, helicopters flying up and down the river, hundreds of state police cars downtown, 6 degrees outside, and we have hundreds of people downtown, freezing, but they're, again, zeal and commitment and exposure made this story really worth covering.
I remember there was a story about one of the people who was arrested, who was an elderly woman, one of the Tinsman families. Actually, it was Mrs. Tinsman. She was probably in her late 60s or 70s when she was arrested. And I remember when she was taken into prison, and they gave them lunch, and they gave out bologna sandwiches. And Mrs. Tinsman said, I'm sorry, but I don't eat bologna. Do you have something else for lunch?
How could you not feel a kinship with them, that this was so important to them that they would go to jail over it?
When we took over the construction site, when we moved onto the construction site, it was a mixture of pickups and Porsches, of old people and young people, of right, left, and indifference. It was a zoo, kind of a circus. It was a wonderful collaboration of everybody whose heart was just telling them that this is the place to be, to stand up in our interests.
I was attending a lot of the demonstrations before I went to work in the morning, and one of the mornings in the demonstrations that had commenced when they had started construction at the site, I managed to get myself arrested in my suit and tie that I was dressed in for work, and I said, well, now I'm going to have to find some way to call my boss and tell him I probably won't be into work today.
As construction was about to begin, Delaware Unlimited there was a phone tree, and you were on a phone tree, and people would call you. This is way before the internet, and you could only contact people by phone. And so you get a phone call saying, please be at the pump site, because we're going to have a march, we're going to have a protest.
I did one very foolish stint as a scuba diver. When they were blasting in the Delaware River, we thought that maybe if there was a scuba diver in the water, they wouldn't set off the charges. And unfortunately, the current was extremely rapid that day, and the first thing that happened when I got in the water was my right flipper got torn off my foot and disappeared forever.
I was a single parent with 4 young children, and I knew I could not afford to be arrested. The only demonstrations I never went to, even out at Limerick, I never got in front of anything. And when we were over there, when they were demonstrating over by the site, in front of the bulldozer or whatever was going on, I didn't go to that because I was a responsible parent.
And I think, our working together in order to pull off what we pulled off was important to have an executive director and other staff. But even more important was the energy and the resources and the talents that were brought by people who were volunteers, who just stepped up, and many of them overturned their lives in order to be able to get involved. And there were no holds barred. It was an all-out dedication.
We shall not be moved. We are women and men together. We shall not be moved. Oh yeah, women and men together. We shall not be moved. Just like a tree standing by the water. We shall not be moved.
Well, I hate to make it a cliche, but it was almost like a family. Our core group was really almost like a family. We really were so connected by the desire to make what we were trying to do happen. And everyone was very kind. And I don't remember any bickering. You often in groups, you do get some of that kind of stuff. I really felt that everyone's voice was heard.
Well, we were really fortunate to have people from a pretty deep experience in diverse backgrounds who assembled for this.
Well, there were an awful lot of dedicated people, and they put a lot of time and work into the effort, sometimes to the detriment of their own personal and financial well-being.
One of the things I would say about many of these people involved in the leadership is they were fearless, because there were times when there was considerable intimidation that was placed.
Then Tracy Carluccio became the executive director, and she was phenomenal. She is a committed environmentalist. She still is involved in trying to do what she can to save the Delaware River and the surrounding areas.
Well, Tracy Carluccio, she brought a level of professionalism to the group that it wasn't missing, it was added to.
Mike Krause and I were the media point people. And Mike Krause, of course, had very strong connections in Harrisburg. He had, of course, a very prominent role in the Republican Party. And he was an inspiration to many of us, and he had a very savvy political strategic mind. Mike really brought kind of a talent and insight that most of us didn't have. I learned a lot from Mike.
We had folks like Walt McCree, who was professional in the advertising business, who was the spokesperson for the organization. We had people who had many years of experience in the political organizations. Mike Krause comes to mind. So we had the kind of guidance from a lot of different areas that helped us to develop a strategy that was very effective and seemed to be of interest to the people that we were attempting to bring the issue to.
We had Bob Sugarman. Bob was just brilliant. Bob was able to, you'd see Bob at hearings with just Bob at the counter at the defense table with a whole bunch of books and an assistant, and then on the other side of the courtroom would be about 15, literally 15 attorneys for PICO, DRBC, Army Corps of Engineers, etc. And Bob held court, held his ground.
Val was a strong presence, and without Val, I don't think anything would have taken hold. And he had a spirituality that many people can't even come close to. And his reverence for nature and the well-being of the earth was second to none.
Val he was an artist and a poet and a wonderful man. And he lived very much by his own rules, and he was inspirational. He's very talented. I have a piece of his work up in that window there.
There are some people, and I could mention Richard Torkelson, Mercedes Gallagher, people on the board, people on the finance committee. Bill Collins did an amazing job with Citizens' Voice, getting information out. They were impressive.
So people like Jim Greenwood, for example, and Kostmeyer, both of them were supporters of the dump the pump fight. I remember I changed my registration to vote for Jim as a state rep because he was against the pump.
Peter Kostmeyer was more than a politician. He was a Bucks County resident, and he felt very, very strongly. And it came through in that speech. I believe that's the speech that I have in the video that I put together.
I mean, it was a natural issue for me. First of all, I thought the pump was a bad idea. I didn't like PE. I didn't want to fund Philadelphia Electric's nuclear reactor in Limerick. I didn't want to provide additional water for development between the river going west to Limerick and Montgomery County.
You can't stop. You can't get tired. You can't go home. If you care enough about this country and about this county and about this river, and if there are enough of us, no matter what happens between now and November, the fact is, if we remove the majority in the courthouse and replace them with a new administration, that in early January next year, they can even undo the damage which those who are there now will have the opportunity to do this year.
Then, that was in the beginning. Then, as the protests really picked up, the protesters said, look, we're not getting anywhere with Warren and the government here. We've got to get more attention. And some people said, well, I know a guy in New York who gets attention every time he opens his mouth.
This recurring presentation of data and science and law wasn't cutting it. I mean, really, the commissioners weren't impressed. The construction company was still coming. The plans were still on, and it was time to do something else. And that's when we hired Abbie Hoffman.
Because there's no such thing anymore as a political trial. There's no such thing as a political prisoner. All prisoners are political prisoners. All trials in America are political trials. And when you go into jail, you see that. Because you see that 90% of the people in jail are black. That's what you see. You see that 90% of the people are young. That's what you see. And you see that 90% of the people haven't even had a fucking trial yet.
I went underground 7 years ago. I was tired, as Victor Hugo describes in Les Miserables, of courts and tribunals and jails and judges. I'd been an active movement person for 12 years, been beaten several times.
The only good education, the only true education is subversive. It's rebellious. It's the only way you're going to learn anything. Otherwise, you know, just watch Wheel of Fortune and New Sports and Weather, bing, 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 that's it.
Abbie Hoffman was a figure of the opposition and a figure of resistance. he had written a book called Steal This Book. And he was, very much anti-establishment. And someone, I'm not sure who, had what turned out to be the brilliant idea of inviting Abbie Hoffman to come and join these protests. And of course, what that did was it suddenly put the media spotlight on the Point Pleasant pump.
I do think that one transformative moment was when Abbie Hoffman got involved, because Abbie brought smart political strategizing to our movement. And we had the dedication, we had the fire in the belly, we had all of that. But without that kind of political strategizing, we wouldn't have been able to move this from a fight on the river to a movement and a fight that dominated for a whole decade Bucks County politics.
Well, it shifted, and one of the big reasons for the shift is the board, through our attorney Bob Sugarman, made contact with Abbie Hoffman, who we discussed. It was a kind of a long discussion among the board, weighing the pros and cons of it, and we decided that we were going to invite him down to assist us, and basically he taught us the lessons of how to organize and create interest in an issue.
I remember when we went up to make the formal proposal to him. We, Colleen Wells and I, went up to New York, went to his place on, I guess it was Lexington, went to dinner, and she was, and we were telling him about our situation. Our situation being that the construction company was coming to the site, was planning to start on the site on a certain date, a few days, and we had done all these press conferences talking about science, got nowhere. We had to do something, and his remark was, "Well, you got to take over the site. You move in, you take over the site," and that's what we did.
He was difficult to pin down. He could be the nicest guy in the world and very intelligent, very kind, generous, but he could also switch in a moment.
There are some, there's some occasions when he would get up on stage and he would stir up the crowd and he would be acting like Abbie. But, as I recall, mostly he kind of just hung around in the background.
I know that I wasn't one of the lead people to come up with ideas about strategy and tactics. People like Mike Krause, Bill Collins, Tracy Carluccio, Al Giordano was a consultant, and other people, Richard Torkelson, Richard Myers, of course.
Because there were so many ideas being thrown out at every one of our meetings. Everything that we did pretty much as a group. With the exception of Colleen. Colleen worked very closely later on with Bob Sugarman, who was our legal counsel, and they were working heavily on all the legal aspects of this and trying to find all the legal arguments as to why this shouldn't happen.
So really the strategy was to stop the export of water and to look at it from every single point of view, to look at it from an environmental point of view, to look at it from a poor water management point of view, to look at it from an economic point of view, to look at the legal problems with removing this water and taking it away from the Delaware River.
Creativity was a very big part of how people were participating, whether it was in dress or in signage or in music, in poetry, in lyrics. We had a newspaper called the Citizen Voice, which was really a wonderful publication, put out tons of those. It was a real update in what was going on in the fight. And then and then there were some other kinds of protests, like when we took over the courthouse, or at least occupied the courthouse for about 53 days, if I recall, 55 days. People moved in. They moved in and stayed overnight for I guess a month and a half, almost 2 months.
Well, there was sort of a guerrilla theater atmosphere.
This was pure political, nonviolent citizen activity.
So it was immediately a confrontation with the will of the people and how they're willing to behave and what they were willing to do, and someone who was able to bring in a tremendous amount of media pressure, or at least exposure, and he most certainly did that.
Well, I mean, initially it was we blockaded the site, and actually on the first day of construction they turned around and went away. I mean, we probably figured that wouldn't be the end of it, but it was kind of a symbolic gesture on our part that no, we're standing here to protect what we believe is right, and you can't just walk into Bucks County and do this.
It was an awesome sight, and to see everybody standing there together with one mind of protecting this portion of the Delaware River and stopping this destructive project was truly transformative for not only myself, but for everyone there. It's like if you've ever been involved with something where everybody is thinking exactly the same thing with the same kind of commitment, that's what it was.
We had sentries out at the lower and the northern outposts and the western outposts looking for construction equipment. We actually had an Air Force, the Point Pleasant Air Force. We had people who had airplanes who were flying around to look for this, for the construction companies' equipment moving in and so forth, or coming along, and just to keep check with the progress, if you want to call it that, of how the other side was doing to make this thing real.
People in costumes, people acting on their own. At one time, somebody took a dump truck and dumped a lot of manure in front of the courthouse.
That was not something that any of us had actually discussed. That was something that Pete Tensman just decided that he was going to make his statement. Basically, he knew a local pig farmer, and he took his pickup truck, or his dump truck, loaded it up and brought it to the courthouse and dumped it on North Main Street as a means of expressing his opinion of the project.
I had returned to the courthouse in the middle of the afternoon, and like I said, it was a very hot day. I opened my car door, and I'm parked about 2 blocks away from the courthouse. I opened my car door, and it just hit me in the face. It was just the most rancid aroma I had ever encountered in my life.
I think the cause would have been better served by people, eloquent people, stating the case. And there were plenty of people who did that, but I think that it got overshadowed by some of the games that were played on the side.
What happened was the protesters were taken in front of Judge Garb, who had issued an injunction prohibiting, denying access to the construction workers to the site. And initially, all they had to do was promise not to do it again, and Judge Garb would let them go. And initially, all of them promised not to do it again. A few weeks into it, some of them had been arrested again, and they went before Judge Garb, and they told them they couldn't promise they wouldn't do it again. So he had them incarcerated.
The judge always said to these protesters, you have got to let the construction go on. There's valid, signed contracts. Let them proceed. And some of the protesters said, no, we're not going to do it. The judge said, well, you leave me no choice. You're going to jail.
I don't believe they ever put me in cuffs. I was arrested twice, was it maybe 3 times at Point Pleasant. But they basically put us in the sheriff's buses and took us to the courthouse in Doylestown and held us in, because the day I was arrested, I think there were like 60 people arrested, and so they just put us in one of the spare rooms in the courthouse, and we had attorneys lined up to take care of the kind of the legal process for that.
There was no question that we were not going to move. And unfortunately, of course, it took them quite a while to remove all of us, but the arrest went on for weeks. People got arrested hundreds at a time at the pump site for a long period of time. And great memories of us, in the morning, I would call the volunteer attorneys who would go and represent the people who had been arrested that morning. And then they would go out and take care of, with the court in order to take care of that.
Some of them were jailed, if you will, at the minimum security facility and told to be there at 6 o'clock in the morning, and at 4:30 they could go home. And essentially then they were just incarcerated while construction was going on. Eventually they ran out of room, and there were so many of them arrested, they ran out of room at the minimum security prison, and they ran out of room at the regular maximum security prison. So they had to start shipping the protesters to other counties.
I do know that they were very, very careful, especially during the protests. They did not want anyone to be violent, and that was a big consideration. The board wanted this to be a peaceful demonstration, as peaceful as it could possibly be. And they even had people, men, boys, men, I don't know, who were kind of larger, that, not bouncers, but big guys who would, if they see somebody getting out of line and trying to be violent about something, they would get them out of the group and talk to them and say, please, don't do that.
I really didn't think that it would get out of hand, because we really had a dedicated group of people that were there to prevent that from happening. It was physical when people were physically restrained and dragged away from the construction site, but we never had an adversarial relationship, with for instance, the county sheriff's department. We respected the fact that they were there for a purpose, and to a degree they respected the fact that we were there for a purpose, and we weren't there to cause them harm.
With all of this hubbub with the pump issue, people say, well, what about the local cops? What about the police department? What about the sheriff? Where were they in all this? I must say, as one who was sitting up in the courthouse watching this, the local police, Plumstead Township Police, the Bucks County Sheriff were very professional, because many of the protesters were their neighbors too.
But the police were there to make it clear that they were in charge and that they were going to prevent the protesters from stopping the construction from starting.
As time went on, we got to be pretty good friends with the sheriff's deputies that were arresting people, and pretty good friends with some of the construction workers. They knew why we were there, and some of them might have even agreed with it, but they couldn't say so.
It was Abbie who advised Delaware that they needed to stage a public referendum on the pump. It was Abbie who brought that up at first.
We were insisting on getting heard. That's just it. It just would not shut up about it, and said, okay, if we want a referendum. We said, let's give it to the people. Let the people vote. Do they want this or don't they? And if they don't want it, then stop it. And the politicians would be, theoretically anyway, obliged to go with the side that they chose.
One of the first things that I did was to get signatures on a petition to get the Bucks County to have a referendum, a vote on even though we knew referendums were non-binding, a vote on the pump, whether people wanted the Point Pleasant pumping station, but obviously it was after the contracts were signed.
The referendum went on the ballot, of course, in March of 1983, when the Board of Elections, which was at the time composed of 3 judges, said that they were absolutely overwhelmed by the number of names that were turned in by Delaware, and they could not ignore this request to slate the referendum.
By and large, referendums in Pennsylvania are advisory. You put them on to get a sense of where the people think. So a referendum was put on the ballot, and it technically would have not been binding on the commissioners. So the commissioners, Elaine Zedek, Andy Warren, Carl Fanauch, said, yes, we will have a referendum. But it would be, and I said, if there is a referendum, it's going to be we're going to be bound by it.
And strategy for the referendum was knocking on doors, was getting as many people as you could, going to various municipal meetings, any kind of meetings that you could go to get to talk about the pump, about the referendum, and why you were against it. It was just getting the word out.
The referendum, however, was kind of confusing in its wording. The judges wanted to make sure everybody who voted on this thing knew what they were voting for, and they how can I say it? They kind of overdid it.
Judges worded the referendum in such a way that if you were in favor of building the pump, you had to vote no on the ballot. If you were against the pump and you didn't want it built, you had to vote yes. Yes meant no, no meant yes.
And we fought for that referendum tooth and nail. We were out knocking on doors, flyering, just in little gatherings and communities all throughout Bucks County. And that really netted a lot of people who became educated on this.
It was some confused notion that they had, and it backfired. It didn't work at all. The people in the community understood what the motion on the ballot said, and they voted overwhelmingly against the pump.
The commissioners had fixed the question that in order to vote no, you had to vote yes. But we won.
We had music and we were dancing, and it was just overwhelming.
Down here in this pipe gallery, we are actually underneath the river level, and the water comes in by gravity into these pumps and then gets pumped upward. The journey of the water system starts here at the edge of the Delaware River. We have intakes at the bottom of the river. The water flows by gravity into this pump station, and it gets pumped into a piping system that goes up the hill and up to the Bradshaw Reservoir. From there, it goes into the Neshaminy Creek, and then eventually finds its way to the Forest Park Water Treatment Plant at Lake.
So after the referendum passed, the incumbent commissioners voted to stop the project. However, there were some court challenges filed, and it took a couple years for it to wind its way through the courts. But eventually, the courts ruled that the contracts that were signed to build the pump were binding and could not be overturned after they had been signed.
So there was a referendum, it was voted upon, it passed, and the next thing you know, we're in court because people said, you can't bait and switch.
And in court, it was decided by Judge Garb that because there was a pre-signed contract, that contract law ruled. It was a very narrow ruling. It was not based on the broad environmental and constitutional principles that our attorneys brought forward. It was not based on environmental considerations. It was based on very narrow contract law. That was wrong.
I was angry. I was angry that we could not change our government, that we couldn't. I was angry that we lost that. That after all of the energy, all of the people that were involved in fighting the pump, that the money that was spent on both sides, that we couldn't change our government.
I was in the courtroom when Judge Garb made the ruling, and I sort of thought it was a foregone conclusion, but my reaction, I kind of went cold and the hair went up on the back of my neck because I had no idea some of the people that were angriest about the situation. I was worried they might get out of control. Is it the almighty dollar that's the most important thing here? Are jobs the most important thing here? Is the quality of life the most important thing here?
Well, you lost the court ruling and the pump was built, but you did turn over the county government. So in one sense, you lost, but those who had favored the pump wound up being voted out of office. So the pump was built. Although, again, the significant piece is that as originally planned, the pump was supposed to suck much more water out of the Delaware than ultimately the decision was. Also, the decision had an influence on the nature of the building that was built in Point Pleasant. So the exterior of the building in Point Pleasant looked like it was a barn, so it looked very much like it would fit in. So all of that, I think, those were all concessions that the protesters and that the protest caused that resulted some change.
Oh no, this project, the Delaware pump fight was definitely not for nothing. The fact that the pump operates now even has its benefits, but also proof that some of our claims were correct. PICO didn't need all that water. PICO, the Montgomery County developers did do what we expected them to do, and they need it, and people need water and so forth and so on. So there's certainly some benefit, some functional benefit. But what's come out of it is that a lot of things. The Delaware River Keeper, for example, the consciousness around the sanctity of the Delaware River, the quality of it and of its attending tributaries and streams became prominent.
I think the whole pump thing was not a win or lose. I think it was really a draw.
There was, they tried the opposition to us tried to paint us as, oh, you're claiming we're going to dry up the river, and we're not going to dry up the river. And, on a realistic point of view, no, that particular project is probably not going to dry up the river, but you have to look at it cumulatively. That project plus whatever somebody else may do down the road in conjunction with the projects that already affect the river.
It just shows that the idea originally was stupid. I mean, it was a stupid idea. It was very expensive. It involved a tremendous amount of mechanics. You had to manage little pieces of this day in and day out. And it was really a stupid project. And I think, in the end, the expense became so great that the utility company, realized it as well.
Fast forward 20 years later. In 2004, I was to be a surrogate speaker at the Percy Owls Club, which is the Republican club in Percy, PA. And the guest speaker in front of me was the PICO legislative director for Bucks and Montgomery County. He started out with a few remarks when this old timer said, "Hey, what about the pump? What about the old PICO pump?" And he responded, "Oh, the pump," and this is verbatim, "oh, the pump was a waste of time and money and probably never should have been built, and we're going to decommission it soon."
The other concern for the protest was there was some fear that there would be environmental damage, that somehow the Delaware River would be negatively impacted. Perhaps the salt line would be coming upstream and would damage Philadelphia's water system. There was concern that the Neshaminy Creek that this water gets dumped into would somehow be negatively impacted. All of that turned out to be not true. In fact, the Delaware River is healthier than it's ever been. The Neshaminy Creek is healthier than it's ever been. The salt line has not moved up. So I think when you add all those factors, there was a lot of hype and hysteria and a lot of doomsday scenarios that people just got themselves all worked up that they needed to oppose this project because of the supposed negative impacts. When you get right down to it, all those negative impacts that were feared never played out.
People walking by us today, you ask them, what's the pump? The vast majority of them wouldn't have the slightest clue. It's a non-issue. There was water delivered to Montgomery County. There was water delivered to Limerick. There were houses built, construction projects that came about that the protesters warned against. That was one of their big issues, that if you build this water and give it to townships along the route, there'll be all kinds of building, and that's come about. But as far as an impact, the Delaware River was not sucked dry. The rock foundation of Point Pleasant was not destroyed, and life went on.
We realized that we had won, but we had lost, and it was absolutely devastating. I think many of us, myself included, felt, what did we do wrong? Felt personally responsible for the loss. That's how I felt.
Somebody asked me if they thought it was worth it. It was worth my time, my energy, hundreds, maybe thousands of people's time, energy, money. I don't know, because we lost.
In some ways, we proved that people can stand up and speak their minds and don't have to be overruled by government. And even if they are overruled, they can still stand up and speak their minds.
No, I don't think it was all for nothing. And I do think that the community bond that was created and the experience was terrific.
The thing that impressed me the most about what transpired was how this issue galvanized a group of people that normally probably wouldn't even hang out together. And I will just throw a little segue into this and say, we could use some of that right now in this world in a big freaking way, man.
We never lose by being engaged. As a matter of fact, we are enriched by being engaged. And it's not just us, but it's the whole fabric of Bucks County that changed. And that is not a loss. That's a win. I would say that when you look at the scale, it was a devastating loss. We'll never be able to undo it. Maybe over time, nature will help us do that. But it was also an enrichment and a transformative movement for our region.
So we lived with it and put up with it, and here we are decades later.
Sure, it's a real simple statement. This is it's going to be the same thing. Basically, Delaware is in compliance with Judge Garb's injunction. Now, whether America is in compliance with Judge Garb's injunction is simply waits to be seen.
split wood, not atoms. We shall not be moved. Oh, yes, split wood, not atoms. We shall not be moved like a tree.